Hello, and welcome to the 72nd edition of Crossing Thin Ice, a podcast series about risk management for insurers. I'm joined today, as always, by Max Rudolph, and I'm Dave Ingram. When you look at today's strategic environment, you immediately run into a challenge. Our old assumptions about how the world behaves don't hold so much anymore. Today, we'll walk straight into that problem. Today, we begin a multi-part series about VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and connecting those terms to the lived reality of global demographics, markets, political shifts, and the growing influence of technology. These discussions will be grounded in examples that span recessions, demographic troughs, structural interest rate changes, supply chain shocks, and even the human stories behind employment cycles. We start that series with volatility. And the general question that we will ask ourselves over and over in this series: what do we do when the past stops being a reliable guide? Before we start, I do want to mention that nothing in today's podcast should be interpreted as investment advice, but it is sure to be educational and thought-provoking. Let's get started.
Acronyms about strategy are a dime a dozen. And it seems like many of those I run across were originally defined by the U.S. Department of Defense. We'll be discussing concepts related to a DoD strategy called VUCA: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Similar acronyms that help define strategies include BANI, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible; RUPT, rapid, unpredictable, paradoxical, tangled; and TUNA, TUNA, turbulent, uncertain, novel, and ambiguous. There's quite a bit of overlap between them. These concepts recognize that an environment rarely evolves in easily predicted ways. Historical data is often not predictive, a generalization I often refer to as an unknown known. Our first topic will be volatility. Mathematicians have strict definitions of volatility tied to variance calculations. The strategist may use historical quantitative analysis to develop a view about future volatility. The layman looks at the term qualitatively, telling a story that includes how big the change is and whether it reflects upside or downside, how quickly it occurs, and how random or unpredictable it is. It can be emotional and contextual, include our behavioral biases, and varies for each person. In a complex adaptive system, no result is linear, and each action interacts with everything else in the ecosystem. Quantitative volatility metrics must be determined from simulations rather than closed-form solutions. If you understand why a butterfly flapping its wings on the other side of the world impacts your local weather, then you're an expert. Time horizon determines the importance of volatility. If goals and constraints are measured over an entire market cycle, potentially decades long, I don't worry much about volatility, as mean reversion leads to it all averaging out. Many models make this simplifying assumption, either due to runtime constraints or dependence on mean reversion, avoiding discontinuous results. But if my interest is determining success over shorter periods of time, then volatility matters. If I'm 6 foot tall and can't swim, about to cross a river that is on average 4 feet deep, then volatility of the water's depth matters a lot. Low volatility means my head will always be out of the water, while high volatility means I'm more likely to drown in a deeper part of the river. The geopolitical landscape is impacted by a broad set of factors, including demographics, pandemics, and technology. The initial conditions and level of fragility are drivers of financial and non-financial results, but are hard to model. A base scenario starts the strategic process, but volatility requires considerations of a wide variety of narrative scenarios, where reasonable assumptions are developed that result in the stated outcomes. For example, a rise in populism could result in a range of outcomes, including one where war is more likely, leading to economic instability and crises, greater levels of global warming, higher likelihoods of pandemics, vector-borne illnesses, and antimicrobial resistance. There are signs today that the rule of law is breaking down, and climate tipping points are being reached. In this scenario, society breaks down food security is at risk, markets freeze up, and in a near worst case that stops short of nuclear annihilation, Mad Max is no longer a movie franchise, but something resembling daily life. Most strategists view this as an extreme scenario, others as closer to a base case. Alternative scenarios can be developed, and decision makers can decide which are opportunities and which should be hedged. The preceding scenario would perhaps be the worst of several potential outcomes that provide users with things to consider. Alternative scenarios would focus more on positive outcomes or some that muddle through a geopolitical scenario. An individual, government, or entity would then choose if they want to hedge or opportunistically accept risks based on which they deem realistic and the cost. An insurer might enter or expand in the cyber insurance market, or if rates are expected to fall, annuity writers could offset the risk in advance. If climate in a region was expected to increase extreme weather outcomes, then property insurers could proactively increase premiums, adjust deductibles, or exit the market. There are many examples where volatility has expressed itself. The 1930s included the Great Depression and the buildup of troops by the Axis powers. A pandemic in 2020 was followed by supply chain challenges, a financial market crisis that was offset by government spending, soon leading to inflation and a surge of populism. We currently are experiencing the growth of artificial intelligence, high leverage, and a buildup of non-bank lenders, with potential outcomes that have great variability. Proactive strategic planning allows decision makers to consider these potential futures and engage. Our initial circumstances don't always reflect the volatility that is to follow. Demographics move slowly and have ramifications for economic and societal assumptions. Changes often aren't recognized until it is too late to alter course. It's expected that equity and bond returns, along with GDP, will fall in developed countries as we age. Theory and past experience tell us that immigrants from growing populations, like in sub-Saharan Africa, should offset this growth, but behavioral science knows that fear over job competition could overwhelm this solution. Our current environment is changing very quickly, with trends from greenhouse gas release, deforestation, and current debt to GDP ratios approaching global tipping points that will limit future choices. I've been researching emerging risks for 2 decades, and it's clear to me that volatility modeled by a probability distribution that we choose from randomly for the next data point just doesn't reflect reality. The further out you look, the less likely we are to anticipate events, and it's not much better in the short term. We don't have random noise. We have discontinuities from events that occur periodically, but not consistently. Many of these extreme events from the past 20 years were not directly modeled in scenario planning, but often were considered qualitatively by emerging risk practitioners. Pandemics, financial crises, and wars have happened before, so why would they not recur, even if their likelihood in any one year is low? How artificial intelligence affects our lives is unclear to me, but that may not be true for technologists who can provide foresight due to their many years of experience. It's important to bring a wide range of experts into the discussion. How will volatility change in the future, and how can you anticipate it when providing information to decision makers? There's overlap between volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. The key is to review each in isolation and also in an integrated fashion. The modeler may be able to utilize volatility quantitatively, but decision makers need to focus on narrative scenarios.
Well, Max, that was interesting. Your essay there about volatility, I wanted to follow up with some questions, digging into that a little bit further. You mentioned that while mathematicians have strict quantitative definition for volatility, the man in the street usually views volatility qualitatively. How do you think that strategists should integrate these perspectives when constructing their scenarios?
A modeler has specific definitions of volatility, adjusting variance parameters for the entire stochastic scenario set. The layman may look at volatility as downside risk, thinking of a deterministic scenario set only. No one complains when a stock keeps going up, but they're much more worried when things start happening that are considered bad. You can think of these views as being built from the top down or the bottom up, and can be viewed as going beyond what a regulator requires. As a modeler, I may have hundreds or even thousands of quantitative scenarios to choose from. My process is to rank them from good to bad and focus on both extreme results, maybe five at each end. Much like I think of a critical path, there's a pathway to failure that can focus mitigation tactics. This can be a single variable or the result of a combination of variables. Were there specific drivers that led to interesting results, either positive or negative? The next step is to set up an early warning system that notes changes in these variables. I find, as usual, that a picture can be worth a lot. Metrics like the Buffett indicator, the total U.S. stock market value divided by GDP, or insurance homeowner premiums for a region can drive proactive mitigation strategies. Data may be split into regimes, with volatility varying at different points in the cycle. The first time I did this, we identified, and this was over 25 years ago, a scenario that would severely stress a deferred annuity block. Interest rates stayed low for a few years, so you earned less than you were crediting based on guarantees. And then rates spiked, and policyholders, now beyond the surrender charge period, left as fixed income asset market values bottomed. This is the scenario that played out for Silicon Valley Bank a few years ago, along with other banks and insurers. Some sold at the bottom, and others still have large unrealized losses on their balance sheets, saved only by the inefficiencies of their clients. From the top down, I can develop narrative scenarios and then model their impact. These can be stress tests based on a historical event or a risk that I know my block of business is susceptible to. Today, an asset manager might look at a potential drop in equity prices and test exposure to liquidity and leverage. Or a life insurer might look at a pandemic that primarily impacts those over 65, like COVID, or those 15 to 35, like the 1918 flu. The key is to use a specific scenario or set of scenarios to tell a story. You still run the models, but they're deterministic, and more time is spent thinking about specific exposures and strategic decisions about whether to accept, avoid, or hedge.
Thanks, Max. That was interesting. You noted that many models rely on mean reversion over long time horizons, and that tends to kind of override volatility. How should the practitioner recognize changes in trend or an extreme starting point in their scenarios?
This is really hard to get consensus on. The change must be structural rather than temporary and irreversible. Many practitioners who are inexperienced or want to deflect ownership and accountability will default to current prices and the volatility assumptions consistent with them. I view this as one scenario that should be run, but may not even be the base scenario. For many financial assumptions, there are underlying projection models about climate or health that a modeler can access. It was useful to note that until recently, reinsurers were pricing for much higher wildfire risks than direct writers, who were required by regulators to use only historical data rather than reflect actual and expected trends. In another example, many years ago, some reinsurers were ignoring volatility when pricing the death benefit on a variable annuity. For other risks, like long-term interest rates, looking at a picture of historical results can be persuasive. My work life started in 1983, a long time ago, and the signal driving interest rates has pushed them down until recently, despite a lot of volatility noise along the way. Once again, it's the 6 foot tall person drowning in a river that is 4 foot deep on average. An extreme starting point is harder to recognize. This is where experience and foresight come into play, but you should still run scenarios with and without mean reversion. Often it doesn't matter, and that is very useful to know. For the modeler, it's useful to monitor both the consensus and non-consensus views. Some examples of potential extreme values today include low bond credit spreads and the low level of the VIX volatility metric. While our focus here is on financial assumptions, biodiversity also provides helpful examples. While studying phenology, look at seasonal events in nature. An increase in temperatures causes plants to flower earlier in the spring, while birds migrate based on the sun's angle, so coming at the same time of year as they have in the past. This can lead to a mismatch with disastrous results for the ecosystem. Expected changes in weather patterns due to deforestation of the Amazon will impact South America, but also across the United States. Would we be more likely to address climate change if we talked about the likelihood of droughts across Europe and North America? We've previously discussed the demographic changes in trend due to longevity and fertility rates, and Dave has been utilizing artificial intelligence techniques and sharing his knowledge. Dave, do you want to add anything to this discussion?
Sure, Max. I'll share a story of something that I learned through my trolling with artificial intelligence. I'm going to share a story that is going to be causing differences in trends and differences in volatility and differences in level of some of the economic variables that we pay attention to a lot. And that has to do with employment. And it is related to the demographic trends we've been talking about. And the story I have that I learned about, many other people may know this story already, but in Japan, they have a story they call the employment ice age generation. And those were folks who came into the workforce in the period between 1993 and 2005. And that was the lost decade in Japan, which was the decade after the boom that Japan had had in the late 80s and early 90s. During that time period, those poor folks that did come out of school in that time, proportion of that generation that never did wind up landing in a stable career was about twice what it had ever been before. It went from about 10% to about 20% of the entire generation. So you had a huge pool of people who went through many years of their career, decades even, doing part-time work and contract work with no stability, no benefits, still living with their parents at age 40 or something. This is quite a recognized phenomena in Japan, and I don't think it was until that generation starting hitting age 50 that they started to have a public policy around trying to train those folks to have at least one productive decade in their career. The in and out of those folks into the workforce or the out of the workforce, I think will change trends and volatility and so on. And we see this pattern replaying itself in China right now. That the number of young people that have gotten good permanent jobs in China in the last couple of years is a significantly lower proportion that hadn't been happening before. The schools are churning out graduates who have nowhere to go. So we need to worry about that in other countries. Europe is going to be entering that kind of a demographic trough, which could lead to periods of recession, which could lead to these kind of employment troughs as well.
Yeah, and even in the United States, some of the things that you're describing about Japan from 30 years ago, a lot of those things would describe today's United States. So it's not something that anybody's going to be able to avoid, and we should be proactive about planning for it.
Yeah, I mean, you hear the stories very recently about 50,000 layoffs of folks with pretty good IT computer related positions. Any students who were going into what seemed to be a great lucrative field coming out with degrees in that may be in real trouble in terms of finding long-term employment. We'll have to see.
Yeah, continuous learning sounds better and better all the time. You can't just pretend like you got out of an exam when you got out of college and kind of dump your head and empty out everything that you learned because everything's going to be additive going forward and certainly is already.
So some of these volatility things, as you mentioned, Max, have a root in a human story rather than a statistical story.
Yeah, we're all susceptible to cognitive biases. A humble practitioner is more likely to be correct, but a confident person is much more likely to be heard. As with more strategic decisions, there are balances to be chosen. Confirmation bias can be offset by encouraging team members to offer contrarian views without judgment, with a rotating assignment for each meeting. You don't want a single person associated with always saying no in these meetings. You want it to rotate. It can be hard to get past thinking about recent events, anchoring to those while ignoring historical or emerging events. When presenting scenarios, you'll always get questions about how recent events will impact your block of business. But a modeler should always be learning more about historical events or events that futurists and external consultants are describing. Many times I've thought that I had a novel idea, only to see that a sci-fi writer had identified the issue 20 or more years ago, and now a movie has been made about it. One example of this goes way back and stands out to me is the Disney movie Wall-E. Third cognitive bias to consider is the availability heuristic, where we assign probabilities to events by focusing on those recent and most prominent in the media. An example here might be that we are currently underestimating earthquake risk on the west coast of the US. Some tools to compensate might be to create a postmortem for a strategy, identifying why it might fail in the future. What could cause me to be wrong? You could compare a current strategy to previous strategies. This piggybacks on something I've always thought we need to do more of, keeping track of previous strategies and tactics and how they played out. Dave, do you have any favorite tools you use to overcome cognitive biases?
Max, here's where I use some of those AI tools that you mentioned. I've been playing around with recently. One of the simplest things to do is to just ask AI, well, what are the arguments against this idea? And in addition, I've created little chatbots that involve characters who will tear apart my ideas from different angles and give me different criticisms. The most interesting result I had in that was in one of them, I told it to create one of the characters as close to reproducing me as it could. That character is particularly tough on me.
Dave, what do you think about how volatility ranks among volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, or the VUCA?
That's a great question, Max, and I think it's one of the key questions for people in the CEO role, trying to figure out how to prioritize what they're paying attention to on this. I look at it a different way, between volatility that's either low or high, or volatility that is variable and somewhat unpredictable. I would say that first type of volatility, I'd rank that fourth out of those four things. And that second type of volatility, I'd rank it first or second. But I think that most people, when they're going about classifying these things, would consider that second type of volatility, the uncertainty in the amount of volatility, or the having a variable volatility function in effect, as something that's fundamentally uncertainty or ambiguity, that pushes volatility, the either high or low volatility type, in my mind, down to the bottom of the list. What's your thinking on that, Max?
My thoughts on VUCA and with these other acronyms is that they're interesting and they can help you make sure that you don't forget something. You really want to have a well-balanced view of risk and emerging risks and events that just goes as broad as possible. And you want to make sure that you don't be limited by any of these acronyms, but try to look for ways to expand your sources. If you're generally tracking maybe a couple of magazines and a couple of conferences, maybe go out and look for a new one, or watch a documentary that may have some impact on what you're doing. So there's value to be had here, but I think it's more on looking at, let's make sure we don't forget something, as opposed to let's start from scratch because we don't know anything to start out with. I think we know quite a bit to start out with.
So it's more a cue to get you to think outside of your normal box.
Yeah, yeah, which is, it's just like cognitive biases. We all tend to momentum, we continue to think in the ways we've always thought, and anything we can do to encourage us to go beyond that is going to be useful.
Here are my key takeaways from today's conversation. Number one, integrating quantitative and narrative scenarios. Modelers often have hundreds or thousands of quantitative scenarios focusing on averages and extreme positive and negative results. Strategists and decision makers usually focus on narrative scenarios. These are deterministic stress tests, often based on historical events, used to tell a story and to facilitate strategic decisions about whether to accept, avoid, or hedge a risk. These two views need to be integrated so that our risk management can be consistent with our strategy. Number two, the criticality of time horizon and structural change. Time horizon determines the importance of volatility. If success is measured over short time periods, volatility matters quite a lot. Practitioners must try to recognize structural changes that are irreversible rather than temporary. It is vital to run scenarios both with and without mean reversion to understand the impact of that assumption. Number three, overcoming cognitive biases. All practitioners are susceptible to cognitive biases. Things like confirmation bias, anchoring to recent events, the availability heuristic. Tools like postmortems for strategic decisions, comparing current strategies to previous ones, and using AI to generate counterarguments are essential for overcoming these biases. Number four, volatility in the context of VUCA. The acronyms like VUCA are useful as a cue to expand sources and ensure you haven't forgotten something. Ultimately, the goal is proactive strategic planning, allowing decision makers to consider potential futures and engage before it's too late to alter course. We must continuously learn and broaden our perspectives to anticipate and lessen the blow from the discontinuities that define our complex adaptive world. We hope that you have enjoyed this edition of Crossing Thin Ice, and if you did, please like, subscribe, and share this with your friends. Bye.